Hi, sixth graders. Welcome back. Today we're on our last A-Day of our review unit. We're on Unit 5 on the Middle Ages. Our goals are to describe Europe during the Middle Ages. So a reminder of where in the world we are. We know that we right now are here in New Orleans, but we're learning about Europe, which is the continent over here. We know this is the same continent where the Roman Empire began, and also the same continent that the Roman Empire expanded to cover, though we know it was also even bigger than Europe. So after the fall of Rome, Europe became divided into many small kingdoms. And we see this in these two maps here. The one on the left is showing the Roman Empire. We see the government was centralized, meaning the same government was found in the entire empire. It ran the whole empire. After the fall of Rome, Europe became broken up into many smaller kingdoms, so it became decentralized. Decentralized is whenever there's not one central thing controlling everything. Each of these kingdoms was ruled by a different king in a feudal society. So let's learn what a feudal society is. In feudalism, each kingdom had a king. Below the king in both rank and power were nobles, then knights, then serfs. This was called feudalism. Feudalism is the exchange of land for loyalty. So here's an example of a feudal society where the king is at the very top of the social structure and they have the most power and the most wealth. They are going to give land and the control of peasants to lords. So you see that arrow pointing down. In exchange, the lords would give the king loyalty and military aid. Take a look now. What did the knights give to the lords and what did they get from the lords? Yeah, the knights gave a lot of military service, whereas they then received food and shelter and a livelihood. And here at the very bottom were the peasants, also known as the serfs. They would live on the land and they did all of the work farming on the land. Here's an example of a medieval manor where we see the castle up at the top. This is where the king and the nobles would live, and then the peasants and serfs would live on the land, and they would farm the land and make the food for the people who lived in the manor. Serfs were not slaves, but they were still bound to the land. They could not leave. So during this time, some new farming innovations happened, and these farming innovations will slowly lead to the end of feudalism. Farmers began, so the first thing was something called the three-field crop rotation, and this is when farmers began rotating fields with two different crops and one fallow field. To leave a field fallow means you do not farm on it. This increased the amount of crops a plot of land was able to grow each year. So it sounds counterproductive to say, hey, I'm going to have 3 fields and I'm going to leave one empty for an entire year. But the reason why this works is it gives the land a chance to rest and breathe and regain nutrients. Prior to this, people were just farming on the same plots of land over and over and over again, and it was leading to the soil being overproduced, and then the soil was unable to be farmed on again. So by leaving the one field fallow and then planting 2 other fields, they were able to get maximum capacity for growing. Here's another picture of what it would look like over the course of 3 years. You see here, you leave one field fallow, you grow one crop and then another, and then you rotate out which one's fallow and which one's growing which crop. This allowed there to be more food produced on less land. Another farming invention was the horse collar. This allowed horses to be used to plow fields. Horses could work faster and longer than oxen, so having horses use horse collars was a game changer for this time period. We also see here, this is the heavy plow, and this allowed them to plow fields much faster with the horses pulling the plows. So all of these farming innovations mean that they don't need as many people farming. So this feudal structure where we have a lot of peasants and serfs farming and working the land is no longer going to be needed because we can get more food from less people with these new innovations. So with the increased farm productivity, less people were needed to farm. More people began moving to cities, and trade became an important part of medieval life. So we're seeing things are starting to change in medieval Europe. As people became less dependent on feudalism, more people began to leave their farms and move into cities. Europe, Asia, and Africa became even more connected and interdependent as trade increased. So remember, they were previously connected through the Silk Road, but now those trade routes are expanding and growing even more. Here's a typical trade city. You see we've got a lot of people around here. Here's a river. Rivers are really important for trade during this time period. So you learn with the River Valley civilizations, they needed the rivers for farming. But as the societies get more advanced and they're starting to get their food from trade, then rivers become important for trade. And here are the trade routes. We see that the world is becoming increasingly more connected. There's more trade happening, and trade becomes really important in Europe. So now the biggest cities are cities that are trade cities. So that's great. Life is changing, feudalism is ending, but there are some negatives that come along with all of these cities rapidly growing. Cities were usually dirty, and they didn't have any real way to get rid of garbage. So they would just kind of dump the garbage out on the street or leave it in the house or outside the house. It was pretty gross. And so as a result, rats were all over the cities. The Black Plague, also known as the bubonic plague, became very common in Europe. This plague spread along trade routes from China. The fleas on rats would actually carry the disease. So the more rats there were in an area, the more fleas there were in the area, and the flea bites would give people the bubonic plague, which killed millions and millions of people. The way that these rats and fleas made it from China was through trade routes. The bubonic plague was responsible for the death of almost half of Europe. This led to the total end of the feudal system. So the feudal system was already weakening, but now with the bubonic plague, it's gone. Here's a picture of what it would have looked like for someone who had the bubonic plague. They would get these sores and boils all over their body. They would get very, very sick, and pretty rapidly they would die. And it was, again, like half the population died because of this. Now, one thing that's interesting is a lot of the people who lived in the country away from cities were more likely to live because they weren't as close to all of those rats. Rats were living in the filth of the cities. But at this time, people had no idea what was causing it. So some people were moving to cities to get safer. Some people were moving out of the cities to get safer. They just didn't know what was causing the bubonic plague or how it had spread. We today, though, know that the bubonic plague started here and it spread along these trade routes. The rats would be carried along the trade routes, and then the plague was spread that way. Here's a chart that's showing us the population. You can see before the bubonic plague, the population of Europe was rapidly going up. And then in 1350, when the bubonic plague hit, the population dropped. And it dropped because people were dying from the bubonic plague. And it took a little while for things to get back to normal. All right, you have 3 questions. Answer those on your paper, and you have a great day.